Hi, I'm Katrina Walker. Welcome to my studio. We're going to be talking about sewing with knit fabrics. And, we all love to wear knit fabrics, right? Knits are great. Where would we be without the ubiquitous t-shirt and sweatshirt and all these things? But unfortunately, so many people are terrified of actually sewing with them. And that's, of course, very, very sad. So I'm going to help give you some tips on how to actually work with these wonderful fabrics. And, some of you thinking, well, I know I need a serger. Well, that isn't actually true. I mean, I love sergers. I have a book about sergers, so obviously I'm into them. But the reality is that, yes, you can sew knits with a regular sewing machine. But let's start out by understanding a little bit about knit fabrics and kind of which ones are the easiest to work with and the hardest to work with. And the fabric that we're probably most familiar with is what we call a jersey knit. And this is an example of a jersey knit. This is actually what we call an ITY. I know my sample's been cut kind of roughly here. And I figure out where my camera is actually looking. There we go. So this is a jersey fabric. Now, what distinguishes a jersey fabric is that it is a single knit. Now, what that means to you, if you're a hand knitter, if you actually knit by hand, this is what we would call stockinette. Okay, so that the knit stitches are on one side of the fabric, and then if you look at the back of a jersey knit, there's actually a right and a wrong side. So jersey knit fabrics have a right and wrong side, and the wrong side is where you'll see what we would call the purl stitches. Okay, so the right side is smoother and flatter than the wrong side, and this is really kind of hard to tell on a really fine jersey like this. All right. So one thing that's particularly challenging about sewing jersey knits is that they curl. If you pull on a jersey knit, so I can tell that this is the selvage edge because I can see, and it's really kind of funny that it has a selvage because this is a knit and it really shouldn't have a selvage being a knit, but oh well, there we go. Because knits are interlocking loops, right? But it has a selvage. So if I pull on this to stretch it, you'll see how it wants to curl. Well, a jersey knit, when you pull it in the crosswise direction, it will curl towards the front side. So if you're not sure whether you're looking at the front or the back, one way to tell with a jersey knit is to go ahead and just give it a tug. Okay, if you give that a tug, then it will curl toward the right side. Okay, now if you pull it in the lengthwise direction, it will curl toward the back. So the jersey knit will tell you pretty much which is the right side, which is the wrong side if you give it a little pull. All right, so just a little note. Now, those are some of the most challenging knits to sew. And the lighter weight they are, the thinner they are, the more difficult they are. But a jersey knit, so that's the hardest. So jersey knit's on one side, right? The easiest knits to sew are what we call a double knit, or they're also called interlocks. There's a type of double knit called a ponte de Roma. That's very, very popular, especially for things like even for pants and things, the ponte de Romas. And those are all what we call double knits. So what that means is, and they call them an interlock because instead of having your purl stitches on one side and your knit stitches on the other, the stitches actually interlock. All right, so that you don't, all you see is jersey stitches on the inside. So those knits fabrics, technically have a right and wrong side, but oftentimes they are identical. They're identical front and back. And good morning from all over. I was getting a good morning from Wisconsin. Hello, Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin. My mother's from Wisconsin. So anyway, so those interlocks are going to be your easiest knits to sew, and everything else kind of falls in the middle there. So the more stable, of course, a knit is, meaning the less stretch it has, the easier it's going to be to sew. All right. Oh my goodness, we even have people from Nigeria. So we are all over the world this morning. Well, it's morning for me here in Spokane, Washington. So I'm in the United States in Spokane, Washington. But that's just always so exciting to see where everybody is coming from. All right. So one thing you can do, besides choosing a knit fabric that's not quite so difficult to work with, but we love to sew some of those beautiful tissue weight jerseys, right, that are such a pain. And why are they a pain? Because they will curl up on you and they will try to roll themselves up and roll across your cutting table. Well, one thing you can do to fix that is you can actually starch your knit fabrics. So yes, this is actually a can of Niagara Heavy Hold. This is from my grocery store. All right, so some people don't have spray starch in their grocery store, but a lot of them do. I will actually lay my knit fabric out, preferably on a piece of plastic or something, because I try not to, with some fabrics, I'll pre-treat them in, say, a large bowl or similar. With knit fabrics, I want to lay them down carefully so they can't stretch, and I try to just spray them on a flat surface. So a big piece of plastic is handy to have. I literally will spray my knits with starch and let it dry, and that really tames them. They don't curl up, and it's much easier to sew them. So there's my first tip. And by the way, I have written up a whole page of tips for you that they're going to post up on the website, on Facebook, and such after the video is done. So be watching for that. And also, there is a download, before I forget to mention it, there is a download from of a knit pencil skirt project that I created for National Sewing Circle. They're putting the code up on the screen so you can see that. And that's a little free project for you if you want to test out some skills. Oh, awesome. We have Boylston, Massachusetts. I do know where that is. I went to Wellesley and Australia and the Netherlands. We are just covering the whole globe today. That is super exciting. But super excited to be spreading the love of sewing with knits. So again, you can pre-treat your knit fabrics to make them so much easier to work with. And that really can save a lot of tears and frustration when it comes to sewing with knits. All right, so I'm of course very tool-oriented, so I want to share with you some tools that will also make sewing with knits so much easier, right? So let me go ahead and go to a sewing tool that I really like. Where's my, oh, there we go. Okay, this funny looking thing, this is called a walking foot. All right, so now my sewing machine that I'm sewing on today actually has what's called dual feed. So it's a FOF, so it has dual feed. So it's like having front feed dogs top and bottom. All right, so if you happen to have, there are some machines on the market. FOF was the first, but there's more that have them now that have dual feed. So if you have dual feed, use that, right? But if you don't, which is probably most people, this is the tool that you want. So this one actually has interchangeable feet, so they can be changed out and removed, which is kind of cool. They have all these different feet you can put on it for different stitches. But let me just grab one. So this is called a walking foot. I travel with this one, so I think it got a little bent. Anyway, this is a walking foot, and they make these. This one happens to be made for Husqvarna Viking sewing machines, but they make these for pretty much every kind of machine. They make generic versions of these. So they attach onto, so here's where the screw goes on to attach onto your machine, where basically the part that normally the ankle, we call it the ankle here in America. The ankle of the foot, this is where you screw it onto the ankle. And this part goes onto, let's see, this part goes onto the needle bar. So let me put my needle down. So the needle bar here is where part would hook onto. Oops. So this little hook thing, this part here slides onto your needle bar. And for some reason on the screen, everything's backwards to me, so it looks a little funny. And we even have people from England near the Salisbury Plain. That's very exciting. I love it. Love it. So anyhow, this is a walking foot, and if you don't have dual feed, you can get a walking foot for even, say, a Singer featherweight. So all different machines, they even make generic versions of this. But the walking foot, the reason I keep talking about it so much, is that walking foot will help to keep your knits from stretching in that it helps to grab the fabric top and bottom and then help transport it through the machine. So that can really be a big help for sewing with knits. It's all about the tools sometimes. All right, so while we're talking about tools, of course, another important tool, and again, it's backwards on my screen, but hopefully it looks normal on your screen. Another important tool is needles. All right, and here's just 3 different examples of needles for knits. Now, the most common type of needle for knits, of course, is your jersey or ballpoint needle. Now, the jersey or ballpoint needle, it has basically a rounded tip. So just as it suggests, a ball point. The reason why you want a more rounded point on your knits is because, especially with a really fine knit like this one, if you use a sharper needle, there's always that it's more likely to potentially snag your knit. So a ball point is really important, especially if you're sewing with a more loosely knit fabric. It's a little more loose because the ball point pushes those yarns in the fabric aside, and it's less likely to split the yarns in the fabric. So the ball point is pretty much our main. Now, a universal sewing needle actually has a very slight ball point to it, so you can use a universal needle if you need to. They're fine, but technically we like to use jersey needles if we can. This is a pretty large jersey needle, really more like an size 80. 70, 80 is usually adequate for most things. All right, another type of needle that we like to use, this is called a stretch needle, and you may think, well, we already have jersey needles for stretching, right? What do we need that for? Well, the stretch needle actually, the way that this needle is shaped is where it curves on the back of the needle. My mind is stalling out here for a moment. But anyhow, the bottom line is the way a stretch needle is shaped, it makes it particularly good at making correct stitches and avoiding skips. So if you're sewing a knit fabric that has, especially if it has a lot of polyurethane or spandex or lycra, those are all the same material, by the way, but they have different brand names. But if it has polyurethane, lycra, or spandex in it, you're going to have a greater tendency to have skipped stitches. And so this stretch needle is designed to help prevent that. And actually, I even use this stretch needles in machine embroidery. If I'm machine embroidering, say especially something like ultra suede, you can tend to have skip stitches, and a stretch needle will actually fix that. So stretch needles are great to have in your little supply list for sewing with a lot of different fabrics. But stretch is for, again, those knit fabrics that tend to skip stitches. And those are usually the ones that have a high percent of stretch fiber in them. So it's not just the knit structure that stretches, but the fibers themselves. That's where you want your stretch needles. And finally, they make twin needles. Twin needles are great. If you don't have a serger that does a cover stitch, you can use a twin needle instead to mimic the look of a cover stitch. I usually go ahead and loosen up my needle tension quite a bit. You need to do some practicing with it and some playing around and make sure that it looks right. But I just want to point out that when you buy twin needles, they actually make stretch versions. So if you're lucky, you may have to order them online if your local supplier doesn't have these, but they do actually produce stretch twin needles. So if you're having trouble with a regular twin needle, they do make a stretch. But again, you want to, if you're going to use this to, copy the look of commercially made knit fabrics with that double stitched hem, you do want to do some sample stitching. And that is true of any of your knit fabrics. You want to go ahead and make sure that you take those scraps from cutting out your project, and you want to have them handy, and you want to practice with them so you can play around with figuring out what stitches are going to work best and what's going to be most appropriate for your project. So let's look at stitches. All right, so let me just get to the screen of my machine. So here we have just some of the, as my machine says, essential stitches. I'm just going to move this down just a little bit. essential stitches. So these are some of the more basic stitches that most sewing machines, even a basic machine, are probably going to have at least some of these. All right, so when we're sewing with knit fabrics, we want to make sure that we're working with the correct ones, and that makes a big difference. So I'm going to go through some of these stitches. Let me just grab something to point with. All right, so here, of course, is our standard straight stitch, which every machine does, right, since the 1800s. And believe it or not, I do sometimes use a plain straight stitch with my knit fabrics. Now, the plain straight stitch, the disadvantage of using it is that it, of course, does not stretch. But I do use it often for basting. Even if I'm using my serger, I often use my regular sewing machine to go ahead and baste. And I will do that with, oh, if I go in, hang on, I'm going to go ahead and mirror. I didn't realize that I was mirroring incorrectly here. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you, Max. Max is my man behind the scenes here, so I couldn't figure out why the heck everything was backwards. So apparently the mirror camera, it was selected. So great. So sorry about the needles being backwards. This is much easier for my brain to see what I'm seeing. All right, onward and upward. So here's our straight stitch. So again, with knits, I actually do use a straight stitch to go ahead and baste in things. Like I always baste my sleeves in, for example. If I'm sewing a t-shirt, I will actually sew my sleeves in with my regular sewing machine to at least just make sure that I can check the fit. Oftentimes with knits, we only have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I want to be able to check that it actually fits before I serge that off, because it's really only going to be a 1/4 inch after I serge it. So anyhow, the straight stitch, you can still use it. All right, next to that, stitch number 2, it looks just like the regular straight stitch, except it's thicker. And that's called reinforced, or it's also called a stretch straight stitch. Remember, it's morning for me, so sometimes I stutter a little bit in the morning. Okay. Plus, you know, live streaming, you always have those little hiccups, right? So stitch number 2, that's our reinforced or stretch straight stitch. And again, you can use this because it's reinforced. It's that stitch where when it sews, it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So it's literally a reinforced straight stitch. And so this can be used for a lot of knit seams, especially a knit seam that does not need to stretch. So not every seam has to stretch. All right. And I will actually answer that question as a question asked about twin needles, and I'll answer that in a bit. So that's a great stitch. Next to this, this is a stitch that's not quite as common, and it's often called the lightning stitch, and you can see why. This is a stretch straight stitch. So this is a stitch that has just enough zigzag into it that it will stretch a little bit. So when you're working with the stitches on your machine, basically, with a zigzag stitch, how it works is, you know, a zigzag stitch goes back and forth. So when the seam stretches, the zigzag straightens out. So that's how it works. So the wider a zigzag is in your stitch, the more stretch you can sew it into that seam. Okay, so just think of that zigzag stitch opening up, and that's what lets the seam stretch without breaking the thread. So as you can see, whoops, my machine went into demo mode, whoops. So that is what that's for, so it gives it a little bit of stretch. Now, of course, when we get into our zigzag stitches, that's where we have even more stretch. There's even a reinforced zigzag. But down here, 9, 10, 11, these are going to give you the most stretch and the most strength. So these are stretchy, but they're not quite as strong. 9, 10, and 11, these are what we call a multi-step zigzag. So instead of just going zigzag, zigzag, it'll go zig, zig, zag, zag, zig, zig, zag, zag. So it has a little bit more strength to it because you have multiple stitches in each zig and zag. Okay. So again, we're just getting into, so first we have our straight stitches with very little to no stretch. Then we have our zigzags for stretch, and then we have our triple stitch or our multi-stage zigzag for more stretch and strength. And on this machine, I happen to have a reinforced version too. Okay, stitch 12, that's a satin stitch. Not necessary, not really necessarily ideal. There's too many stitches in it. All right, we get down to some of these others. Some of these fancy stitches are for like 15 is a good stitch for, say, bridging two pieces of elastic. So is 16. So we can get into other stitches that are going to more mimic maybe what you would see on a serger, or they'll give more stability. Some of these stretch, and some, actually all of these will tend to stretch. Not the honeycomb so much, but these should give at least some stretch. All right, but I do want to point out down here on the bottom, stitch number 18. So it's not a vampire's mouth. Now, number 17, this is a blind stitch, a blind hem stitch. And the blind hem stitch for a woven fabric, see, has straight stitches in between the little teeth, right? Now, the 18 looks more like like I said, a vampire's mouth. It has actually zigzag stitches in between the teeth. And that's how you know that this is the blind hem stitch for knit fabrics. So anytime you have a zigzag stitch, that is appropriate for knits. I was just going to look and see. Here's overcasting stitches. Now, overcasting stitches you may or may not have on your machine, and that's fine. You're fine. You can sew with just a plain old zigzag. But these are stitches, again, more inclined to look like what we would see on a serger. Have more strength to them. Some of these, like stitch number 6 and 5, these are actually designed to stretch quite a bit, but they're a little stronger just the way they're structured. Now, there's a specialty feet for overcasting, and it's called overcast because they're technically designed to be sewn with a specialty foot that allows you to sew right along the edge of your fabric, and that's why it's called overcasting, because it's going to stitch over the edge of your fabric. In other words, it's going to overcast the fabric. But again, I mean, just to show you, when you're doing your testing, you can play around with these and just see what you like best for your particular project. But you don't have to have all these fancy stitches. Regular stitches will be just fine. So I'm going to circle back, actually now that I'm not mirrored anymore, and address that question about twin needles real quick. Let me just grab my needle package. So we got our Zwillingsnadel, our stretch needle, twin needle. So the question was asked is, how do you thread with on your machine? When you thread your machine with a twin needle, let me just grab my camera here. Excuse me if you get a little dizzy here. Let me just. So when you thread it, now sometimes there's going to be two different threading posts. So I'll put a thread on each post. Now this particular machine is built to use a thread stand, but you don't have to use that. But you're going to, with holding both threads. Oh, I'm sorry, my audio cut out. So this is how to thread for a twin needle. So let me just double check that I'm still, yep, my microphone's still on. Live streaming. Okay, so when we thread, so some machines, again, will have dual spool pins. So I would put a spool on each pin. And this is pretty common. You can also buy, if you don't have two spool pins, you can actually buy a thread stand to set behind your machine that will hold the other thread. But we're going to go through the threading path just like normal with both threads. Just hold them together through the threading path. Now, when you go through the take-up lever, there's basically a left and right side. Now, I do like to split the threads, and I do like to have left and right, one on each side of the tension discs. So I do like to do that to, oops, sorry about all the moving around. I do like to do that to try to. help with the tension a little bit. It's probably not doing that much of a difference, but I like it. When you come down to your actual needle, let me just switch cameras here. Okay, a lot less moving around. Whew, isn't that much nicer? Okay, so when we get to our actual, just above the needle, there's usually a little bar here. You'll go through that. Some of them have a left and a right thread guide. So you would, again, one thread would go to the left, one thread would go to the right, come down, and at that point, you would thread your needles just as you normally would thread a needle, but obviously one thread would go into the left, the other thread goes into the right. Okay, so that part, that's the threading. But when we get to tension, with a twin needle, you always want to pay attention because twin needles are actually designed to do something called pin tucking. All right, so the needle tension will actually cause the fabric that's in between those stitches, in between the needles, to pull together. That makes a little raised edge, and that's called a pin tuck. So that is what twin needles are designed to do. So how do we keep it from tucking when we want it to lay flat? Well, the answer is you loosen your needle tension. And how that is done is going to vary depending on your machine. On my sewing machine, it's going to be, a touch screen thing. On yours, it may be a dial up here in your threading, above your threading area. So you'll need to look at your machine manual to tell you how to loosen those stitches. All right, so I just generally play with my stitch tensions and I will stitch out various samples. Now, another thing you can do to help it lie flat, and this takes us back to our tools, is there's various kinds of materials you can use to help stabilize. Stabilizer is important, not just for embroidery. Stabilize your fabric so that it doesn't tunnel. I'm just not going to take the time to go ahead and thread it with a twin needle right now because I only have, I think, one spool of thread handy. Oh, and by the way, thread. When you are sewing with knit fabrics, I do strongly recommend, whoops, there we go, strongly recommend that we work with polyester thread. Now, it doesn't have to technically be silky polydeco, but you just want to use, I do recommend polyester just because it's very strong. It's very strong. It's going to hold up the wash well. And so, and polyester thread actually has a little tiny bit of, it can actually stretch a tiny, tiny bit before it breaks. So it gives you just that little bit of extra insurance as well. But I do recommend polyester thread for sewing with knits. So while I was thinking about thread, I needed to mention that. Okay, but there are various types of materials we can use to help make sewing knits easier that help to stabilize our knits, stabilize them. So I have all these rolls of things here. So this is a type of a wash away sticky stabilizer. Okay, so this is a wash away material and it's actually self-adhesive, and so when you place this on your knit fabrics, and it could be just a real icky, like this little ITY I'm working with, it's kind of icky. It really stretches. A piece of wash away stabilizer, you can use that for your seams or your knits, especially if you didn't starch them. And of course, once that wash away stabilizer is on there, they're not going anywhere. It can't roll, it can't stretch. And so it's much, much easier, much easier to sew because, well, you've just glued it down basically. And then once you're done sewing it, this washes right out. So that is really a great tool to have. And again, this is a sticky, wash away stabilizer. Now, even if it's not self-sticky, This is a piece of wash away film, and I'm just going to cut it a little shorter here. But this is a piece of wash away film that I've just cut into strips. And you can use even a washable glue stick. Now, I personally do prefer Elmer's. They make these for fabric, okay, but I'm too cheap to buy those, so I usually just have Elmer's. But you can actually use a little Elmer's. It's easier to apply it in some ways to the film rather than, if you apply it to the fabric, you have to be careful not to stretch the fabric, right? But I can put some of that, now it does make the film want to curl up, but you can use a little bit of Elmer's washable, because it has to be washable, the washable stuff, but you can use a little Elmer's glue stick, and you can glue this, you can use that to stick that on there, and that will even stabilize that knit to make it easier to sew together. All right, and you can even stick this between two layers, basically. So if I put some more glue stick on the top side, then if I take just make sure I have this right sides together. Which way is it rolling? It's rolling that way. So if I didn't have time or it wasn't possible to starch this to make it easier to sew, I can go ahead and basically glue with wash away stuff, glue a layer of stabilizer in between my pieces of fabric, and now they're not rolling, and I can take them to my machine and I can sew them out. So I showed you a whole bunch of stitches, but we didn't actually look at, you choose which one is the best one, and I will come back to those stabilizers, believe me, I will. But I wanted to, while my brain is on that subject, yeah, how do we decide which stitch to use? Well, if I just select a plain old straight stitch and just sew this with a regular straight stitch, oh, I don't have my dual feet engaged. I was wondering, it's like, why is it doing what it's doing? Should engage that. But here's a plain old straight stitch, and you can see I had a little bit of gathering there at the beginning. But what I want to do is test that. So I will stitch a little sample on some scraps. Like my scraps look pretty rough here, but that's okay. It's just a scrap. And then when I will go ahead and try to break that. Now, this one's been sewn on a stabilized piece. Let's sew it on a non-stabilized piece. Oh, and by the way, here's another tip. When you're sewing knits, one of the things you can do, sometimes people will kind of tend to stretch their fabric as they put it into the machine. If you kind of push it forward into the machine, kind of keep a little bubble ahead, that can also help to keep from stretching the seam as you're working. All right, so I'll stitch a little sample. And this looks pretty ugly, but I expected that. Okay, and then I'll just give it a pull. Okay, how easy is it? Now this is a really stretchy fabric, so it broke pretty easily, as soon as I gave it a good tug. Now again, not every knit garment, if you're making an oversized t-shirt that's not, going to fit very tightly, it doesn't necessarily need to stretch very much. So, but usually again, if I'm using a straight stitch, it's just to go ahead and it's to just baste it together, and then I'm going to either use a zigzag or I'm going to serge it or something. So I don't really worry about that. But let's go back to the machine. Actually, let's choose a different stitch. So let's try the lightning stitch and just see what a difference it makes. Let's see how much more stretch we can get and more strength we can get out of our lightning stitch. Okay. Again, I'm just working with a single layer that's probably the most stretchy. It's also the least stable, and I don't have any stabilizer in here. But I am sewing with dual feed, which helps. Now, the fabric behind the machine, I can go ahead and onto it somewhat. It's somewhat stabilized with the stitching, so if I need to grab onto something, I can. And I could also lengthen this stitch. This stitch is looking very, very, very narrow and very short. So I'm going to lengthen it. Now it'll be stronger as a short stitch, but so this is our lightning stitch. This ITY is really putting it through its paces. So there's the lightning stitch, and actually I'm stretching it pretty hard. If I really pull, there, now I can get it to break. But actually there was quite a bit of bounce to it before I went ahead and broke it. So this is really all there is to it. Is seriously, take some scraps. You're going to want to go ahead and think about, of course, think about what are the performance requirements? How does my finished project need to perform? What kinds of strain is it going to be under? And how am I going to use it? And that doing these tests, and again, it's as simple as stitch it out and try to break it. And that will tell you a lot about which stitches are most appropriate. But sometimes there is such a thing as we like the way they look. So let me go back to, so you might choose more of an overcast style stitch, for example, because you like the way it looks. So maybe I'll go for, say, stitch 2. Now, I don't have the correct foot on my machine, and here's another important thing to mention is that feet matter. Okay, so a foot that is appropriate for a zigzag stitch or an overcast stitch is one that has a tunnel, has this cutout space behind the foot. This is a FOF, so it has this gap here for that dual feet I mentioned. So it looks a little funny, but here's the stitching. This is behind the foot. See how it has this groove? Now the foot that's on it is for straight stitching. So you see, it's perfectly flat. There's no tunnel. So if I'm doing stitches that are wider than this area, they're going to tend to get caught under the foot because this is a straight stitch foot. It's not intended for that. So make sure you're using, also when you're using these knit fabrics, if you're using a zigzag stitch, make sure you use the correct sewing foot for your zigzag. Okay, so I've switched my feet, and I'm actually going to stitch on my stabilized sample. Now also for your seam allowance, remember that if your machine is stitching a zigzag, when it comes down to the left, it may be further than 5/8 of an inch. Let's say you have a 5-inch seam allowance. So you'll want to also double check, get your ruler out, put that needle in the farthest position and double check exactly where your seam allowance should be. So make sure that you stitch accurately. Even though, so I might look and 5/8 of an inch in this case is really more at like 1/2 inch now. So I would want to use 1/2 inch. I could use a guide on a guide on my machine to set there. I could use a piece of blue painter's tape. I like to use blue painter's tape sometimes as a seam guide if I'm not using a fancy tool for that. But there's all different ways you can do that. But you just want to make sure that you also test to make sure you're stitching in the right spot. Now this is that piece of fabric, or 2 pieces of fabric with the wash away film sandwiched between them with glue stick. So I'm just going to stitch a sample, nothing fancy. And see, even with the stabilizer, I have a little bit of tunneling going on. This stabilizer, this film is not very stiff. It's not very stiff. That's just the best way to put it. So I might want to choose, this is an extremely soft, it's a very thin knit, so it's difficult to sew. So if I'm seeing this kind of thing going on, number one, I can loosen up my stitch tension a little bit. That will help a little bit. But I'll be better off, I should probably use a stiffer type of stabilizer underneath it. Let's just try that. I'm going to stick some of this onto the back. We'll see what a difference that makes. I love wash away sticky stuff. Okay, let's try this again. Oh yes, much better. See the difference that made? Just changing out the stabilizer? Now they're laying perfectly flat and smooth. So you really need to do some testing and what a difference that makes, right? So I couldn't find my official wash away sticky. This is actually a wash away paper tape. Kind of crazy, wash away paper tape, but I know it will work in a pinch, so that's what I'm using. So if you have a 5/8" seam allowance, but you want it to look more like you're using a serger and you're not using those special feet that allow you to sew over the edge, knits don't fray. So you can, with your knit fabrics, you can simply, after you've stitched it, I'm just going to cut out this nice looking little sample here, but you can just sew your seam and then just trim off the excess. You know, you don't have to, again, you don't necessarily have to have a serger. This is a wash away paper tape, so I can actually just tear away the excess. Found it on Amazon somewhere, I don't remember, but like I said, this will wash out. But much nicer looking stitch than the previous samples. So again, just to show you what a difference just some stabilizer can make. So this was with the wash away film. You know, it may have helped with the stretching, but it allowed the thread tension to pull up the middle here. But I didn't adjust the thread tension at all. I just put a different stabilizer on, and then I had perfect stitches. So stabilizer is important, especially if you're going to sew knits without a serger. All right, so let's look at some other types of stabilizers. This is a fusible. So this is a fusible web. This is a paper back, so it has paper on one side. It has a fusible. If you can kind of see the shininess of it on the other side. And I use these a lot for hemming. So if I want to put a hem into, let's say, a neckline, this is a 1/2 inch, and I don't have my iron heated up, so I'm just going to show you how it works without doing it. But let's say I want a 1/2 inch neckline on my t-shirt. So I will line up, this is a 1/2 inch wide, at least I believe it is, 1/2 inch wide fusible web. So I will go ahead and just gently basically tack this on with the paper still on. Obviously you need the paper on. And then I can turn my hem. Now, of course, if it's curved, if it's curved, I'll just cut little slices into the paper, not the fabric, but just the paper so that I can curve it around. But I don't peel off the web, I just leave it attached. But anyhow, I can use that paper inside to go ahead and press. Again, I haven't peeled the paper off. I'll just go ahead and press this with the paper in place to get my nice clean pressing line. At that point, then I can go ahead and peel off the paper and finger press it in place, because I'll already have established that nice crease. I'll finger press my hem, make sure it looks good, and then I'll fuse it in place. Fuse it, and then I'll stitch it. And it just makes absolutely beautiful hems on t-shirts. They just look perfect. And you use your twin needle, you're good to go. All right, so you want really lightweight fusible web. So make sure it says lightweight, or like if it's steam-a-seam, it should say steam-a-seam light. You don't want it to be heavy, because if it's heavy, the heavy stuff is too stiff. All right, there's too much glue, it's too stiff, and it won't allow the hem to lay naturally. What I find with the really lightweight fusible webs is that sometimes they're kind of a pain. They don't always want to stay on the back of the paper, but the lightweight fusible webs will actually allow it to behave pretty naturally. And because we don't really want it to be, glued down permanently. We're going to stitch it, but it just helps to give it that tiny bit of stabilizing and holds it in place while you stitch it. And then going forward, if it kind of breaks down a little bit, doesn't matter, it's stitched down. So just using those lightweight webs are really great. Okay, one other type of stabilizer I want to mention is this is a fusible stabilizer tape. Okay, this one, as you can see, it's actually great woven. I say you can see that because see how you can see the weave structure. This is straight, so this means it does not stretch. So where you use this is, say, if you have a shoulder seam in a knit shirt that you do not want to stretch, you would want to fuse this down on your stitching line on the wrong side, and this will support your stitches and keep those shoulders from stretching out. Okay, sometimes people even use, you can use, believe it or not, clear elastic. You can actually put clear elastic, and that will help to keep it from stretching out, but it will let it stretch. The only downside with clear elastic is that it doesn't live forever. So clear elastic does break down over time. Now, it takes several years. It does take a few years, but it will break down eventually. So just FYI. They also make bias versions of this fusible tape, fusible stabilizer, which makes it better to curve around things, but it's not quite as, absolutely stable as this one is. But these are all some little tools to help you with your knits. Now, one thing I didn't mention talking about all of these was what kinds of pins to use. So I better touch on that real quick. So let's see. So, well, on my wrist pin cushion here, I love this thing because I like wrist pin cushions and I like magnetic pin cushions. So this is kind of the best of both worlds. I love this thing. I just got this from Clover. But when I'm using pins, what I like to use are very, very fine. You want your pins to be fine and very sharp. Otherwise, they can potentially snag your knit. So these are a fine glass head pin. And these are a very long, very lightweight flower pin. Now, some of mine are bent. The bent ones aren't so great for knits because, again, they might also have little nicks on them that will snag. So be very careful. But what I really actually prefer to use for knits is actually what we call wonder clips. So these are wonder clips. And they come in different sizes. So this is a really skinny little one. This one's very narrow. But as you can see, you just can literally just clip them on. Now they have marks on the back for measurements. Like if you want to clip in only at 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch. I don't usually care about that too much, but I find that these really do help to hold those knits together very firmly. And if I'm using a serger with my knit fabrics, I like them because I can't run over a wonder clip with my serger blade. If I accidentally miss a pin while I'm serging, it can go into my serger and then the pin and everything else. But this won't go into the cutting blade, and so it's kind of a little insurance for me to make sure that I didn't do something stupid and serge over a pin. So I love them for that reason too. But I like these a lot for holding the edges of my knits together. And I was talking about how you can use, your stabilizers, of course, to make your knits easier. But, if your main problem, if it isn't so much the stretching, if it's the curling that's the problem, because again, on a jersey knit, if you pull it in the lengthwise direction, it rolls toward the front, towards the right side. So even if your problem is just curling, again, at first I would starch it, but if you can't do that, just, go ahead. Whoops, sorry, I was off camera. Forget this one's pointed over here. Okay, so you can, Notice I'm just using little short strokes. I'm not going back and forth. That will tend to stretch it. I'm going in the crosswise direction with just little tiny stretch strokes. But even just, if it wants to curl, just that little tiny bit of glue basting can really help. That is the wrong side. I must have been pulling in the wrong direction. Don't know why it's curling, but, oh wait, right sides together. It was correct. Okay, but even just a little glue basting can at least help keep those edges from curling. And if that's your biggest challenge, then that little bit of glue stick will take care of that. Okay, so again, we have there's a little downloadable project for you that we've posted up. Max has put the QR code. If you want a little pencil skirt project, how to make basically the world's easiest knit pencil skirt, there's an example on the screen. There's a video on here somewhere with me making one. But anyhow, it's just a super, super easy way to just whip out a knit pencil skirt if you're so inclined. But also after this is done today, they're going to post up also a link where you can get most of the tips and tricks that I've taught you in class today, or in this video today, with already written up for you. So the question was asked, where can I purchase the wash away sticky stabilizer? It appears to be 2 inches wide. It's actually a paper tape, and it's actually 1 inch wide. Because I couldn't find I have rolls. I want to say Floriani.com. I want to say Floriani makes a wash away sticky stabilizer pre-cut in different widths. Okay, you have to kind of look around. Easiest way is probably just if you have a roll of wash away sticky stabilizer. So I use Sulky. Like this is a roll of Sulky Solvy. Now this is the film stuff. This is the wash away film, but their regular what they call Fabri-Solvy, they make a sticky Fabri-Solvy, and you can just cut it into strips, however wide you want. Oh, that reminds me. So another thing I'll do with the wash away strips. Now, mind you, this is going to be a bit, if nothing else, Eileen, you can always go to my website, katrinawalker.com, and you can email me, and I'll look it up. So you can do that as well. Because sometimes, I just can't pull off the top of my head. But there's at least one, like I said, I think Floriani makes one. You can look up the wash away already cut into rolls. I wish everyone did. But, in a pinch, I just get out my sticky Fabri-Solvy and I cut strips. Speaking of, okay, hemming. I talked about using a Fusible, but actually using the wash away sticky works brilliantly for hemming. Now, mind you, this is, of course, an extremely short piece. So I'm just going to do it on one end. So when I want to put a hem and I want it to wash away, I don't want to fuse it. I want it to be a wash away. If I want to hem a particular depth, and this, by the way, this works especially well when sometimes you have knit fabrics that are real open. It's a lace knit. It might be stretchy and open structured. If you take your sticky wash away stabilizer and cut it the width that you want your finished hem to be, all right? And you're going to want 2 pieces. Because what you do is you take those 2 pieces, cut the width you want. So let's just assume I wanted a 1 inch hem. So you're going to put one down, of course, along the edge of your fabric, one inbound. And because it's 2 pieces, you can just very easily, once it's stuck on there, fold it up. It'll be exactly the hem depth that you want. And then you can stitch it in place. In fact, let's just do that. You can stitch this in place. Let me just choose a stitch. I use our little lightning stitch. So you choose your stitch, and you can just go ahead and stitch that hem. Of course, I'm using different colors so you can see what I'm doing. Stitch your hem in place. It's perfect. And then, of course, this will wash out, and everyone will think you're just a genius. Of course, remember that knits don't fray, so I'm not so much worried about that, but I'm glad that reminded me that that's another way to use the sticky wash away stabilizer is, again, you want to cut it the depth of the hem. Whoops, close up. Sorry about that. Like I said, you can tell it's morning for me. So here is my little quick and dirty hem here. So again, you want to cut your stabilizer the width of the hem, the width you want, and you cut 2 pieces because that allows you to go ahead and fold right on the line of the stabilizer. Because you might think, well, why wouldn't I just cut it twice as wide and then fold it in half? Well, it just gives you a cleaner, easier fold if you use 2 pieces the correct width. Trust me on this, it's just easier. You can even take, if it's wash away stabilizer, you can even take a little glue stick and you can even glue stick it together while you're working to make it even easier. But anyhow, this is one I used a lot, especially, again, if you're working with a lace, a stretch lace, or other real open knit that's a challenge. Okay, so that's all the time we have today. I hope that you had a chance or get a chance to download all of the tips that I shared with you today. And I just thank you all over the world. We had quite the audience this morning. And just thank you for joining me. Again, I'm Katrina Walker, and it's been a pleasure. So happy sewing.